Welcome back to another episode of the Hybrid Health Performance Interview Series, where I interview local Singapore experts on all things longevity, health, performance, and overall fitness. Today, we had Dr. Jorming Goh. Dr. Goh is a researcher and assistant professor at NUS and is researching how exercise affects our longevity. He's published in all things from exercise, inflammation, cancer, and how movement really affects our biological system and immunity. And as hybrid athletes, we all know how important our health is now, but we actually learn how a lot of the things we do now between resistance training and cardio actually builds the base for our longevity going forward and can even help fight things like cancer. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Your work frames exercise as more than just fitness, actually kind of frames it as medicine.
Right.
Can you break down what that means at the physiological level for the body?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at least for the past 20 years, what we have realized in the exercise physiology field is that when we exercise, when we contract those muscles, we are stimulating the muscles to behave as an endocrine organ. So what that means is the skeletal muscle then releases things like hormones, right? And these hormone-like molecules have been termed myokines. And these myokines are very fascinating because they're essentially signaling molecules that go throughout the body. They could go to the brain, they could go to the heart, they could go to the liver, the pancreas, and so on. You get the idea. So they spread throughout the body. And that's just from, contracting your muscles. So when you're moving about, when you're getting up from a chair, when you're going for a walk. So then, I think so for the past 20 years, the people in the exercise physiology field have been trying to say, okay, what are those kinds of molecules, and can we then isolate them and know the identity of these molecules so that we can, let's say if we can have people exercise, can we develop pharmaceutical mimetics? So that's where the whole term of exercise mimetic comes from. But then what we realized also in the past couple of years is that it's not just the muscle that's releasing these molecules. You have the liver that's also releasing these molecules. You have the brain that's also releasing these molecules. You have your fat cells, the adipocytes, that are also releasing these molecules. So then, for lack of a better word, Professor Mark Tarnopolsky from McMaster University in Ontario, he coined them exokines. So any molecule, signaling molecule that are being released as a result of exercise, as a result of these kinds of movement, human movement, were termed exokines. And it's been found that these molecules, because they have such a profound impact on a distant organ, then it's thought that this is where these signaling pathways could then lead to organ adaptation. It could then remodel the organ to be in a better shape. Right? It can remodel the immune system to be better able to withstand or repel viruses and so on. So that's where the story gets very fascinating, right? When we say exercise is medicine, you tune your muscles, you tune your body to actually produce your medicine that your body needs.
So when when you think about exercise, we always say it's like a positive stress on the body, right? And so it sounds like the movement of the body, with the muscles is it is literally releasing something to the body to help it build that adaptation.
Absolutely.
Which makes it, stronger, healthier.
Right.
And it sounds like we can almost kind of isolate different, maybe you can talk about this next, of like either movements or parts of the body, whether it's, your legs versus your upper body, is actually releasing different signals.
I think that's a very good point, Dan. And, I think, so where we are is really the cusp of all these technological breakthroughs, right? A lot of us in the field are using those omics technologies to try to understand what are those thousands of molecules that are being produced and the identity and what type of muscle contraction. But while it's very nice to envision that from the molecular level, I think practically it's more difficult to get somebody to perform certain kinds of movement. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure you appreciate that. So most times when we look at a lot of these kinds of exercise studies, most times they're either done on a treadmill or they are done on a cycloergometer, like a stationary bike. You don't always get the situation where somebody performs something along like hybrid, right? Mm-hmm. Hybrid training where you have concurrent aerobic and resistance exercise done, and then you try to isolate or identify those factors that are being produced. I think suffice to say, at least when we did a very small study, we did a pilot study a couple of years back, looking at young women versus postmenopausal women doing very light intensity exercise, okay? And this is really just looking at them either doing a light zone 2 cycling versus stationary cycling versus them doing like lower body strength training or strength exercise. So that was like a leg press, leg extension, and leg curl. So I want to see, okay, if you were to just isolate on the lower body, would there be different kinds of inflammatory molecules that are being released during exercise? So we saw that before and after each of those exercises, we got the women to donate some blood, and then we looked at about 96 different inflammatory factors that were being released, and we saw that up to a third of them were different depending on the kind of exercise. So to go back to your question, it really does seem as if the kind of contraction or the duration of those kinds of contraction, the intensity, the kinds of muscle fibers that we call on would have an impact on the molecules, the factors that are being released. So then it brings us to the point, right? If we say exercise is medicine, then how do we best prescribe exercise as an anti-inflammatory medicine for different kinds of chronic diseases? We now know, for example, things like cancer, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes. There's always, or not always, there's this inflammatory component. It can be driven by inflammation. Right? And now inflammation in the longevity field is like the rage. Everybody's talking about inflammation. So then the question now is, then which kinds of exercises would be better suited for which types of inflammation-driven chronic disease? And I don't think we have the answer yet.
Okay. Yeah. So, it sounds like the current state of things are, we know exercise, causes a stress response on the body that is actually, maybe acutely inflammatory, but, has a longer response of being anti-inflammatory.
Absolutely.
And the next step is, we know that there are these more long-term diseases, that you get when you're older, like cancer, that are obviously very inflammatory. And the next step is to look at, how does exercise over the long term potentially, I don't want to say prevent, but maybe make cancer, something like cancer, less intense, take longer to develop. Like, would that be, kind of where we're at now?
I think you've got it spot on, Dan. It's really, and I think you shouldn't have corrected yourself there. Exercise can prevent onset of chronic diseases, including cancer, right? They've done all these large epidemiology studies where they follow people over decades, and they found that the most physically active folks were the ones that would have the least incidence of reporting cancer, right? So yes, I think what you touched on earlier on inflammation is true. Our inflammatory response is really an immune response, right? When you get cut, it's an inflammatory response. You call on immune cells to actually come to the injury site to repair the wound. And when it's repairing the wound, it calls on an anti-inflammatory response. So that's like the balance, right? The yin and yang, there's a pro and there's an anti. And then at the end of that, it needs to mop things up. That needs to be a resolution of inflammation. So this whole cycle has to be well regulated for a healthy immune system, for healthy inflammation. And then just now you alluded to the point about exercise being inflammatory, and that's true. You do need to have that kind of inflammatory response to drive adaptation, which is ironic, right? So around 2006, 2007, there were some scientists, I think from Europe, Copenhagen, I think, they tried to answer the question, okay, if we were to dose with vitamin C and vitamin E, right, it could block the inflammatory response. Would that be a good thing? Right? Most of the time we think it's actually a good thing. But then what they found was that when they took muscle biopsies from those subjects that took the supplements, the vitamin C and E supplements, they found some dampening of the adaptation signals. All right, and this has been known. And the point being that, okay, maybe training at a certain level shouldn't require you to have megadoses of vitamin C or E. And this was just, again, isolated to just vitamin C and E, right? But then they found that, look, if you wanted to train to get to a certain level, you want to have a certain kind of muscular or cardiopulmonary adaptation, you probably don't want to supplement. Or maybe that you'd have to wait, maybe a couple of days. So that's the timing of those supplementation that needs to be involved.
Yep.
But I think they really addressed the point where you need that inflammatory signal to be released first and see how the body responds, okay, before you get some level of adaptation. So then, on the flip side, when we think about things like overtraining, and overtraining could also be a state where there is overinflammation and there is anti-inflammation. And there's a point where training has become so intense that the tapering hasn't occurred or hasn't occurred sufficiently. So then that's where we come to like recovery, and that's probably where we do want to have some level of supplementation coupled with rest, coupled with tapering off, to get that adaptive response.
Yeah. So it sounds like, and maybe there is more research on this, but like, there's the, we'll call it pro-inflammatory part of exercise, right? Which we know to be good, but we also have to remember to include the recovery aspect and think about it the right way. I know when I talked to Dr. Vincenzo that he talked about how, putting oxidative stress on the mitochondria is good, but if you blunt that response too soon for it to allow to have the adaptation, then you're essentially kind of like nulling all the hard work that you already did.
Absolutely.
Right? And I think, lately it's, in the health influencer world, it's kind of come out that, when you ice bath, you don't want to do it after you work out because it's blunting the hypertrophy adaptation that you're going for, right? If you're going to do it, like do it before, do it hours after you work out.
That's right. That's right. Then I think, Dan, you just touched on this concept of hormesis. Hormesis is like have you heard of that? Yeah. So it's really a very cool concept. Literally, it's like what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So it was, toxicologists have found like in 50 years ago, they found that if you were to dose a plant or a mammal, with a small amount of poison or a small amount of drug, that there is usually this kind of a biphasic response. A little bit is good, too much is not good, somewhere in the middle might be okay. So then they realized that this same thing could also then be applied to exercise too, right? You don't want too low of a dose because then what kind of biological adaptation are you really inducing, right? Neither do you want too high of a dose, but maybe somewhere in the middle, this optimal zone, again, it differs from individual to individual, right? And then as a person gets fitter, this optimal zone could shift, right? But then where in that threshold is the best zone, right, for both health and fitness? I think that's really where, because now we do see the confluence of fitness and health, I think that's where these questions become more and more relevant.
Yeah, you'll have to remind me, when we talked previously, you had talked about some research that showed that, and maybe I'll say this and I'll jog your memory and you can talk to us about it, is that like a little bit of like exercise doesn't do a whole lot for you, and a whole lot of exercise also is like almost equally as damaging. And there's this kind of like happy middle ground. Maybe it was like research on marathoners or something. I don't know, does that jog anything for you?
I kind of remember that this conversation took place when we were having a coffee chat. Yes, I think this goes back down to extreme physiology, right? So when what we learn about like things like marathons or ultra endurance races, we know that they're extremely taxing, extremely stressful. The body actually breaks down, right? So the muscle tissue breaks down, the heart muscle breaks down, and for certain individuals that may have some risk that supposedly predisposes them to a cardiac arrest, right? That could be these kinds of unfortunate events that could happen. But what we know is, at least from these very extreme studies, that individuals that could withstand that, right? And are there useful markers of damage that we could measure and quantify, right? And can we then know that if we push a certain person, certain athlete this much, they could still withstand it. But then again, the research hasn't shown us, long term, or at least not that I'm aware of long term. What does that mean? Let's say in the long term, if they continue to train in this manner, or if they were to taper off, what are some of those detrimental effects, or are there any detrimental effects? Now, back to your question on a little bit of exercise, I think again, then that needs to be very specific to what kinds of population we are asking, right? Because, and this is where I have a very, I have a big, what do you call that? I have a gripe with 10,000 steps, right? Because 10,000 steps is an arbitrary number. And 10,000 steps, you could run 10,000 steps and it could probably be excellent, right? Wonderful for adaptation. But 10,000 steps, if you're shuffling or just walking really slowly throughout the day, my question then is, has it reached the minimal threshold necessary to induce any kind of beneficial impact? Let's just say we need to contract the muscle at a certain intensity for a certain duration in order for blood glucose to be used up in the skeletal muscle. Okay, and as a hybrid athlete, you use that very quickly.
Yep.
Now, if we use that analogy and then we say, okay, look, exercise is good for treating type 2 diabetes. And then we say, just go and walk, go stroll around or go walk 30 minutes a day. The person's walking, but the percentage of muscle fibers that are being called upon is not like 80%, it's not 90%, it's like maybe barely 20%. So it's like barely a twitch. At that level of physical activity, because it's not exercise, at that level of physical activity, is it even enough to even drain the muscle glycogen? Because that's where you want to soak up glucose, right?
Yep.
Is it enough to actually cause a dampening in the spiked glucose response in diabetic people? The answer is a clear no, a clear resounding no. So I find it, fascinating that the field hasn't evolved, at least public health messaging hasn't evolved with the advent in sports science, exercise physiology knowledge. It's kind of still stayed at that very generic level where, do more, or just cover this amount. But it doesn't tell people that, look, exercise is medicine if you use it right. It doesn't mean that you should just use, I don't know, in this part of the world we use Panadol, just use the Panadol for everything. It can be a panacea for everything, right? I don't think it works that way.
So, when you think about the different kinds of exercise,
Sure.
we talked about hybrid athletes, right?
Yep.
So you're doing, your cardio and your resistance training.
Right.
What do we know about those different, I'm sure there's even nuance between those two, but when you look at those two as a whole category, what kind of response is the body getting from the resistance training versus the cardio?
If you put the two together?
Well, I guess independently and together.
Independently and together. So if we look at them separately, with aerobic or endurance kinds of exercises, you're looking at really more catabolic. So your body eventually is breaking down things. It's breaking down muscle glycogen, right? And then beyond a certain point, it's going to start breaking down fat, and it's going to start breaking down protein, right, to use as a fuel. But that is purely endurance, and we're talking about things more than 20, 30 minutes sustained. Now, in the hybrid competition, it's very different. You're running 1 kilometer, but you're running 8 times, right? And then you're running at a much higher intensity. And it's unlikely that during those times that the body's actually going to be tapping into things like fat or protein. Maybe after, but not during the race. On the other hand, the strength exercises, what's happening is there's going to be microscopic tears in the muscle fibers, right? That we all know. And at some point, the immune system is going to call upon the muscle cells to actually start repairing themselves, right? So those are the responses that we know. But when you put them together, I think it's going to be interesting. We know enough to say, at least, that the inflammatory response is also going to kick in, right? We know that, let's say, if you were to do this for a couple of days consecutively, we know that your immune response is going to go up. But if you were to train it this way, you could still get stronger. Your immune system would still adapt. The reason why I say this is because we did something similar before. There was even a thing called hybrid training, or what do you call that? High rocks.
Yeah.
We did this study in around 2015, yes, 2014 to 2016, right? We recruited about 7 or 8 healthy young men. We made them run on the treadmill for 5 minutes, okay? At, I think, I can't remember, it was like maybe at VT2, so beyond zone 3. And then in between the runs, I think they did a total of 4 sets of runs. In between their runs, they would then go do like, I think it was a squat, barbell squat, and they would do like a barbell row, a dumbbell row, and I think there might be some bench press in between. Okay. I think so. I think there were three main exercises.
Kind of hitting all the major muscle groups.
Yeah. Yeah, and then they would get back on the treadmill again.
Mini high rocks.
Mini high rocks. Yeah, so that was actually the thing. And then they did this. So we recruited them for 3 weeks. They did 3 weeks of 3 days of consecutive exercises like that. Then every week, so on the second and third week, we actually increased the intensity of the workout. Well, what's interesting is we look at some of those damage markers, right? Interestingly, I think for creatine kinase, we didn't see it elevate, but we saw the other typical immune parameters go up, some of the inflammatory panels go up. But then after that, they stabilized, right? There was no more difference between a pre-post or 30-minute post-exercise because we're looking at that in the bloodstream. So it's possible to use that as a gauge or rather use that program, right, to train. You could do that every day or 3 days a week, which is what we did, and the body will still adapt, I think, to a point. Yeah. So if you're interested in that paper, I can send it to you. You can share that with your readers if they're interested.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's, probably extremely relevant to a hybrid athlete, right? Because they're trying to do both,
right?
And it sounds like, there's probably more research needed, but you're kind of getting the best of both worlds by doing both, where if you're only doing one, you're only getting kind of one side of the house's adaptation opposed to both.
Sure.
So I'd be curious with, like exercise being medicine, we also hear, like proper food and like hydration is medicine as well.
Right.
How does the response of the body change based on its, proper food intake, like whole foods, when it's hydrated versus when, maybe your diet isn't as good, maybe you're in a calorie deficit, maybe you're not properly hydrated? Like, does that change how well your body responds when it's under these, stressful states during exercise?
For sure.
Or can you kind of like get away with it a little bit?
I think in terms of a performance angle, I think you definitely want to, have a well-nourished diet. And in the absence of that, I think that's really where some supplementation can be helpful, right? We're talking about things like if we're looking at a hybrid athlete specifically, then things like creatine would be useful, right? And now we are finding out that even, with a lot of the new studies out there, that creatine is not just for maintaining muscle strength, but it's also important for cognition. So in fact, a lot of people in their 60s and 70s are hearing that, and now they're taking creatine daily.
So, I'm trying to get my dad on it right now.
Oh, good. Yeah, yeah, that's great. Yeah, like me, I'm trying to get my mom on it too.
Yep.
Yeah, so all these, I think, really in the absence of a nutritious diet, I think some level of supplementation, especially for athletes that are doing these kinds of extreme fitness events. And I say that also because while we think our diets are healthy, I think most times what happens is maybe the food preparation, maybe because of convenience, and if we look at the whole food supply chain, right, we may not be getting the most nutritious diet that, let's say, our ancestors could be having. Let's just say truly organic stuff. So in that sense, some level of supplementation may be necessary to maintain performance.
Yeah, I know in the US, I don't know about here, but in the US, it's like 50% of people are magnesium deficient, and they believe, part of that is, with even when you eat whole foods and stuff, just the way, the soil gets turned over when you have your spinach or whatever, higher in magnesium is not quite what the label reads.
Absolutely.
And so, it sounds like it's kind of tough to be a modern human in the sense that you try to do all the right things, but even then you can kind of, fall short of the markers that you want. And, when you're trying to get all the performance out, looking at supplementation does start to make sense.
Right. I agree. And I think it's really, it's a good time right now, I think, to be in this field, because I think it's really asking the right questions. It's really hitting on the right questions, and it makes us realize that a lot of our systems could be suboptimal. And I think with the work that you are doing, I think you're raising this level of awareness, and at the same time, I think promoting fitness, promoting health gives people that added incentive, to try to pursue these kinds of questions further. Right?
Yeah, well, so I know, something that like really interests me is, so I have a history of cancer in my family. I think 3 of my 4 grandparents had it, and my dad just beat it. So it's, and I know you have a lot of research that is about, when the body's exercising, how does it, respond to cancer? So I was hoping you could kind of talk about some of that research, and then maybe how important exercise is to, like what we kind of alluded to earlier, kind of like either pushing it out or, potentially eliminating the risk of having something like cancer as you get older.
Absolutely. So I think, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to talk about cancer. I think at least in the past 10, 15 years, we've understood that cancer is really not just about genetics. Sure, it's partially driven by genetic predisposition, but at the same time, there's this whole concept called the seed and the soil concept, right? The seed being that growing tumor, but it has to be kind of nurtured in a soil that is hospitable. So when we think about the seed and the soil concept, then it makes a lot of sense. Because then we start looking at cancer not just in terms of genetics, where it seems like it's a predestination, right? But rather than looking at this from a perspective of an ecosystem or from a garden, right? How do you trim off the weeds? How would you protect the flowers that you're growing in your garden, right? Is it the soil? Is it the water? How much care are you taking care of your garden? So to address what you said, now with this seed and soil working model that is firmly established, we know that all these hallmarks of cancer, which is actually interestingly where the aging hallmarks came from, right? There are those, I think about 8 or 9 different hallmarks of cancer, right? So they're self-sustaining, they are inflammatory, they are metastatic. So it's essentially these characteristics of a cancer that defines them, and they all usually behave this way. What's interesting is all these potential hallmarks or characteristics of cancer can be attacked with exercise, right? So exercise can do the following things. A cancer that is growing in an environment that is devoid of oxygen, we call it hypoxia, right? In an area in a body where there's very little oxygen, then what happens is this cancer is poorly oxygenated. So then the signals that it's calling out for is to say, give me more oxygen. And then the body responds by trying to feed it blood vessels. And it's at the same time, it's trying to feed it nutrients. Okay? What's interesting is when a person exercises or a person with cancer exercises, those blood vessels become better. They are not as poorly formed. Because when cancer was calling out for those nutrients, those blood vessels are growing too quickly, and they were very poorly shaped or structured. So the structure is very poor. Now with exercise, what happens is it actually triggers this concept, or there's this process called angiogenesis, so the growth of new blood vessels surrounding the growing cancer. So you may think, hey, but wait, that's a bad thing, right? Not necessarily, because combined with chemo, combined with cancer-killing drugs, pharmaceuticals, you can then penetrate the inside of cancer more easily. You see? Yeah.
So it's like more open because there's like new growth around it.
There's new blood vessel growth. And back then, a lot of challenges in conventional chemotherapy is that the cancer cells, the cancer drug, it's kind of like indiscriminately killing a lot of cells. Okay, it's killing off the cells that are growing the fastest. So namely your hair cells. Number 2, a person's gut lining. So that's where all the hair loss happens, where the nausea happens, because those are dividing really fast. They're trying to kill those cells because that's essentially a cancer cell. Cancer cells growing really, really fast. They're doing the same thing. But the problem is they're killing off those cells from the outside, but sometimes the very core of the cancer, the tumor, may not be penetrated by conventional chemo, right? So then with exercise therapy combined with chemo, it's usually better because then the blood vessels are bigger, the integrity is better, the drugs can actually penetrate the cancer. That's just one example. Okay. Some of the other things that we found, and this is after more than like 10 years of us asking the same questions, how does exercise then shape the immune cells that are surrounding the cancer? We call this a cancer microenvironment. There's this kind of a nice analogy. We call these specific kind of immune cells called macrophages. They're like Big Macs. No, but seriously, not Big Macs, they're like Pac-Man. They are very, very interesting because they are like the utility toolbox in the body. They don't just help you kill off, in this case, cancers, but they also help reshape your muscles. Macrophages are essential to remodeling in many different organs. But in this case, so in this case for cancer, what we found is that, at least in mouse models, we found that in mice that ran, they presented more with the kinds of macrophages that are supposedly anti-cancer. There's more of these, what we call the M1 type, which are more cancer killing. And then there's the M2 type, which actually helps support the cancer cell growth. And we saw that, relative to the mice that didn't run very much, the mice that ran more actually had the highest amount of the M1 macrophages. So it's likely that you shift, and when a person has cancer, that person is able to shift those kinds of immune signals even within the cancer microenvironment. And that is like, then you're killing the cancer cells, right? That's another analogy of how, or another example of how exercise can, be beneficial for people with cancer. And a third example would be where exercise, essentially you're depriving nutrients, or you're using up nutrients for your muscles. So then I think this other concept is where exercise is competing, or the muscles or other organs are now competing with cancer cells for fuel and potentially lactate, right? Lactate and muscle glycogen, but potentially lactate. So let's just say if the person is undergoing certain kinds of exercises and then they're able to just use up lactate more efficiently, and lactate isn't around to drive the cancer growth, because yes, cancer cells actually use lactate to drive some of their growth, which is also an anomaly. They call this the Warburg effect, which is really where you have lactate when it's considered low oxygen, but the cancer cells have that also in spite of it being, there is oxygen, but they are able to just co-opt all these different signals to make themselves grow faster. And we think that exercise is one mechanism in which you can kind of pull away some of these potential nutrients that are feeding the cancer cells, then thus depriving them of their growth.
So it sounds like for someone that has cancer, exercising can, kind of like signal the body to that, kind of offset all the signals that cancer is creating to get, nutrients, energy, call it what you want. Instead of it going towards the cancer, pull it back to the body for the mechanisms that it kind of should be doing, right? So whether, it's like while you're in treatment or potentially, just to kind of starve it off, exercising to keep your body, I think you could argue naturally how it should be working, right? Because once upon a time we were running around hunting and farming, right? The body was using all of its different signals and energy all the time for its core functions of moving the body. It can really help, during the cancer treatment process. So I'd be curious, for let's say someone who's 40, they've been exercising, most of their life. They plan to continue to exercise. Does that baseline of, we'll just call it general health, right? Let's assume they just run and do resistance training as well.
Yeah.
Does that baseline make it so that cancer as well is harder to grow? Or is it that, like most of the research currently on when you have cancer, this is what exercise does to it?
That's a great question. And I think then for the most part, the kinds of cancers, let's just say epithelial cancers. Epithelial cancers would be those like the breast cancers, the prostate cancers. Those cancers respond very well, all right, to, let's just say, for lack of a better word, those exercise signals. I think what may be more difficult to treat would be things like, let's say, liver cancer. Let's just say pancreatic cancer. Those that actually occur deep within, let's say, an organ, right? And I think that's the problem. The problem being that it's really dependent on the kinds of research funds that are available to us, these kinds of questions, right? So there's been a ton of work being done on colon, breast, prostate, but not enough being done on, let's just say, even glioma, right? Brain cancer or other kinds of rare cancers, simply because, I hate to use the word, but simply because there really isn't a market for it, right? So those signals that we think might be useful may pertain to, let's just say, those cancers that we most commonly hear about. But maybe with these other cancers, we don't know as much yet, right? But does it mean that exercise is not going to be useful? I don't think so. Because I think what exercise fundamentally does is that it increases, and again, I don't have a better term, but it increases resilience. When a person is exercising, all the organs are undergoing some kind of stress, right? All the blood flow or oxygenation is going towards the muscles. So it's kind of siphoning, again, same thing, right? Siphoning off resources from the rest of the body. So it's treating the body as a battleground. They have to get used to this kind of stress, and then they get better, right? So it's always this kind of stress, de-stress, biorhythm that the body should be having, rather than this constant sedentary, no stress. But then eventually the sedentarism drives, growth of body fat, drives growth of inflammation, right? And drives a whole bunch of other stuff because people are chronically stressed. They're chronically then inflamed. So I think exercise has its part to play, I think, in terms of building up the body's reserves, building up the body's resilience. And that is, again, we're just scratching the very surface. We're just talking about things like aerobic and resistance exercise, strength exercise. What about other things like mind-body integration? And those have such a huge amount of impact that we don't know about. But I'm sure they're there. Yoga, Tai Chi, or whatever kinds of like movement arts that are more meditative in nature has a calming effect, right? And I think combined in whatever manner with these kinds of physical, hard, exercises, I'm sure that would bring people back to vibrancy, back to great health. Yeah.
So I think that's a great transition to the next thing I want to ask you about, which is recovery, right? So we know how important it is to move the body, get it to a stressful state where we're, creating that healthy inflammation signal. And, in the case of like performance and resistance training, right, we want to create that hypertrophy effect. So what do we know about recovery today that people, whether you have some like tips, the science behind of what good recovery looks like? Because I think when you look at the kind of health influencer space, right, there's a lot of things on how to build the most muscle, how to up your VO2 max, but there's not a whole lot of stuff because there's nothing to really sell on how do you recover better. So I'd love to hear your kind of what we know about recovery, and then maybe what some of your favorite kind of like recovery tips and tricks that might be useful to people.
I see. Thanks. I think, in terms of recovery, one of the best things, and really I think the underappreciated thing, is sleep. And I think people think of sleep as negotiable, but the point is it's not negotiable. And just now you kind of touched on the point of magnesium. Magnesium glycinate, right, for example, is great for sleep. And for other things, for recovery, I think nothing else could beat sleep as much as, if people could have 7 or 8 hours of deep, uninterrupted sleep. I think that's really where, maybe not the science, but I think most people take that for granted, right? Because of this kind of hustle culture. Everybody's trying to maximize time. But I think that whole downtime before sleep, I think there is a purpose to it. Because technically, we're not supposed to be up 16, 18 hours a day. It's only with the advent of the industrial age where we started having artificial lighting, right? So how does that change our circadian rhythm, right? May also be driving some of the factors that lead to chronic disease onsets. And I think, and this is where people probably don't want to hear, right? But people need to realize that the longer you stay up at night, like between 11 to 1 a.m., 11 p.m. to 1 a.m., I think that's where the timing of all the organs are actually crucial for repair, right? Like for example, each of our organs, our muscles, our liver, our brain, they have something called a clock gene, right? So those clock genes actually then regulate certain processes that are necessary for health. And what happens then is, if those genes are being turned on at the wrong time, then I think what's going to happen is a lot of these signals are going to be maladaptive, right? So I think what you just brought is like another can of worms, which is really chronobiology, right? Should we be training based on our circadian rhythm, right? Rather than, let's say, for example, everybody works, and I understand the social impact of working out, not working. Everybody works and then they go for a workout in the evenings. But then when the workout is pushed beyond a certain amount of time and it encroaches on sleep, then that's where the person doesn't recover fast enough, right? And imagine you're getting a lot of benefits, but then you're not recovering well. So then you're still not optimized for whatever you're trying to do. And I think this is one fact that you brought up in terms of recovery that I think we don't appreciate enough. And if we were to, let's say, exercise or train based on our, I think there's a word for it, it's called chronotype.
Yep.
Then perhaps we might be able to get a bigger bang for our buck.
So I know something that really interests me when we talked before was that you've done some research on the Hadza tribe, which, for the people that don't know, are like kind of our closest relatives to how our ancestors would have actually lived.
Yep.
Based on what you know about them, the research you've done, looked at, what can we take from kind of their lifestyle, movement patterns, and apply to our lives for more kind of like integrated natural living?
Wow, that's a very big question to dissect. I think one thing we learned from the Hadza and the Tsimane tribes, so Hadza's from Tanzania and the Tsimane is from Bolivia, right? These are the hunter-gatherer forager tribes that still are very active today. And what we've learned from their lifestyle is that they are pretty much active the whole day, right? And they don't go to the gym, right? They don't run for the sake of clocking junk miles. But let's say for the men, when they're tracking a prey, for example, for they're hunting, right? Then they are tracking for miles on end. And then they are kind of, when they're getting ready for the kill, then they're sprinting, they're throwing, they're shooting with bows and arrows. They are then lugging it back, right? So like kind of the movements that are very similar to what we do in the gym, right? The pulling and the hoisting. So those kinds of exercise like slow, long endurance, um, sprinting, right, anaerobic, and some lifting, some pulling. All these engage the major muscle groups, taxes both the aerobic and the anaerobic system. Plus, they don't eat extremely. They don't eat a lot. They eat probably not non-processed foods, right? But from their exercise routine or from their movements, we can see that none of us are doing the equivalent of what they do. I mean, the closest people in, let's just say, in modern society that's doing kind of similar things to them would be the Amish.
Mm-hmm.
Where the Amish people would cover 15,000, 20,000 steps, 18 to 20,000 steps a day. But modern day societies, most people cover like 5,000 or 6,000 steps. Okay, so I mean, we're again going back to steps because most people can understand steps.
Yep.
But then taking away from all this, I think what we really want to say, or really what we want to take away from, is that these hunter-gatherer tribes show that you don't have to, go all out on your fitness. But I think maintaining certain kinds of rest, certain kinds of bursts of activity throughout the day may be what we're most naturally programmed to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Do you think that's why, like, when when I hear health influencers talk, right, a lot of the research comes out about, like, you want a lot of your cardio to come from zone 2, a little bit from the higher zones, right, and it kind of emulates what our natural movement pattern would be of probably did a lot of jogging to wherever you were going to go hunting,
mm-hmm.
then you did, took a little rest, and then you had a few sprints in there,
Yep.
And it kind of like, it's like that is the best way to work out for us because that is how we would have naturally moved the most.
I would imagine that's that's probably the concept. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's where the whole notion of being physically active and now imbuing it with like the current terminology comes in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
To kind of wrap it up, something I like to do is kind of give you a question and
Sure.
you can take it any way you like, is that, within the, realm that you research and what you're interested in, is there anything that you're looking forward to that is, coming out in either the research side, interesting modalities, whether it's, supplements, something else, or, things that are becoming more popular in the general health space that get you kind of excited?
That's
So you kind of take it any way you like.
That's
right?
a tricky one. I think one of the things that I've been exploring, really kind of tinkering and also speaking to people in the field, is really this whole idea of the plasma transfer concept. But that's you see.
And do you mean like from one person to
That's
another,
correct.
like Brian Johnson did
That's
with
correct.
his kid? Okay.
Yes. But my spin on that is, look, there are some folks doing this already in Norway. So Professor Ulrik Wisloff is already doing this, where they have people that are, well, first of all, young and very fit. Okay, they are research participants. They would then donate their plasma, I think, once every 6 weeks to older people with Alzheimer's disease. Because again, remember just now when we first started this conversation, we were talking about how exercise releases all these factors in blood. I think from an altruistic angle, right, if people were able to donate blood, let's say autologously, and store the blood long term, or for others to actually donate blood or plasma, right, in this case, and doing a bout of exercise before, perhaps it would have some beneficial outcomes for different kinds of chronic diseases.
Interesting.
We just don't know what
Mm-hmm.
they might be, and I think it just was a very fascinating discussion that I had with Ulrik a couple of years back. I think his one concern was that there probably won't be enough blood or donors to go around, right? But I think just thinking back, Dan, I just thought back on my career, and I thought back on, what would be the one thing that exercise could do, right? Maybe this could be it, right? Can you imagine if instead of just going for your regular blood donation, you could exercise and you could donate plasma, and then that is potentially useful, right? So that's one thing, and then it just kind of got me thinking too. Well, if also we're talking about like mission to Mars, right? Spacefaring, could these also be potential ways to to buy an insurance, right? You want to restore some kind of vitality. Would this be one mode of bringing a vial of exercise plasma? Yeah. So I mean, those may be things.
That's interesting. I never. It kind of like keeps you, going while you're in. I mean, I forget how long it takes to get to Mars, but it's not quick, right?
6 months or something. Right?
Yeah. That's a long time in zero gravity. Because I forget what it is, but when they come back down, haven't they shrunk?
Everything,
right? Because you don't have the fluid in your vertebrae because you don't have the compression, so it doesn't need it.
Yeah. Then they pretty much have to go through 6 to 9 months of rehab again to get them ready to walk.
Yeah, that's a wild concept.
Crazy, right? Yeah.
I know, that's interesting. That'd be pretty cool.
I mean, if you were to ask me, maybe that would be really a big moonshot, using exercise or using what we know, right? And to tease out some of these intricate biologies of exercise, of movement.
I think I'm down to go to space and look at Earth.
Okay.
I think Mars is where I call it though. I can go to Arizona.
You could go to. Okay.
It
looks the same, right?
It's the same, right? I mean, it's hotter, right? Mars is cold, but.
Yeah.
So the time today.
Thanks
Thank
so
you.
much, Dan. Thanks.
I really hope you enjoyed that conversation with Dr. Goh as much as I enjoyed having it. I thought it was really interesting to hear about our ancestors kind of really have created the base of how we think of training today with Zone 2, but also resistance training throughout their daily lives, and maybe how we can adapt more things like recovery to optimize the adaptations we're going for and really improve our long-term health. If you're interested in some of the supplements that Dr. Goh talked about, like magnesium, creatine, we actually have them already built into Hybrid Hydration, which is the only hydration supplement designed specifically for hybrid athletes to not only optimize your hydration, but help improve your performance and create a better base for your recovery. So if you're interested in something like Hybrid Hydration, you can go check us out at hybridhealth.club. If you're interested in some more of the research that Dr. Goh talked about, you can find him on the NUS website.